William Shakespeare, Jane Austen, Leo Tolstoy, Ernest Hemingway. These are some of the most famous writers in recent Western history. And what did they all have in common? Whether by hand or with typewriter, they wrote using ink on paper. With its wide availability, durability, and compact size, paper gave these writers a medium with which they could reach the world. When we consider this, it becomes clear that Shakespeare in the age of writing on a clay tablet does not become Shakespeare. Maybe a talented local storyteller, but not Shakespeare. And nobody is writing, let alone reading, War and Peace on papyrus scrolls. Paper allowed their writing to be shared throughout the world, finding a global audience. These writers are still household names hundreds of years later, and the most essential process that birthed this into reality was not necessarily the words they wrote, but what they wrote with: paper. The instruments we use to write, and the process that developed them, has completely changed our world. So much of our culture, our history, our entire systems of education and business would not exist without paper. But where and when did this process begin? Like we learnt last episode, we made our first steps towards writing somewhere around 4000 to 3000 BCE, and it was clay tablets that were used. With a stylus, often made from a reed, markings would be made in the clay while it was still wet, and then placed in the sun to dry. The ingenious thing about this approach was that the clay could simply be softened again with water and reused. This, however, left the clay tablets extremely fragile, so to preserve and strengthen them, they would be fired in a hot kiln. This period of writing technology, despite its limitations, still birthed a great amount of writing that was more than just inventories and genealogies. Poems, recipes, stories and myths, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, were all written with clay tablets. But when considering the number of tablets involved in the sharing, transporting and storing of any significant length of writing, this was a far from ideal process. We needed the next step of the process for writing to reach its full potential. At the same time, another parallel technology was being developed in ancient Egypt, a technology that is sometimes confused for being paper. It came to be known as papyrus, and was made by cutting long, flat strips of the papyrus plant and laying them side by side on a flat surface. Then a second layer of strips was applied over the top at right angles to the original. These two layers were then hammered together while damp, which meshed them together. They were then dried under pressure to produce a flat surface for writing that could be rolled into a scroll. While papyrus was cheap and relatively easy to produce, it could not be folded, and the surface was prone to splitting and cracking when frequently rolled and unrolled. However, even with its limitations, it was a big step up from clay tablets, and the use of papyrus spread from Egypt throughout the civilized world, undisputed king of the writing technologies, until a new competitor emerged. The next big step in the process of what we write on had been lurking in the background, alongside papyrus and clay. There are scattered instances of animal hides being used as a writing surface from as early as 2500 BCE in Egypt, mostly in the form of something similar to leather. But compared to papyrus or clay, this was an expensive and complicated material to produce, so it never really took hold. That was until somewhere between the years 197 and 167 BCE, when it is believed that the people of the Greek city-state of Pergamon perfected the creation of what we now call parchment. They refined the process of using animal hides to create a writing surface that far exceeded papyrus in terms of its durability and flexibility. But with papyrus still the dominant choice and in plentiful supply, parchment was not really needed. And it would not have spread any further had it not been for a war that decimated the Egyptian economy, halting papyrus exports to the rest of the world. As papyrus became harder and harder to access for the literate world beyond Egypt, Pergamon was ready and waiting to up their production of parchment, and it began to spread as the premium writing technology, a position it held for the next 1,000 years, in particular throughout Europe in the Middle Ages. But how did we get from parchment to paper? Like so many of these processes throughout history, the process of paper begins as multiple separate parallel processes that then merged into one. Because while all this was happening in ancient Greece and Egypt, China had its whole own process happening, and they would change the writing process for the whole world. China's first forays into writing technology are believed to have begun with the use of bone tablets or bamboo strips that were written on using a brush. The bamboo strip design in particular was quite clever, with vertical strips of bamboo laid out side by side, which were then sewn together into a segmented surface that they would use to write vertically down each strip before rolling it up like a scroll. They also experimented with writing on silk, but this proved far too expensive. Then somewhere around the same time as Pergamon was producing parchments, China did it. They invented paper. We don't know what led to it, we just know that there was no paper, and then around 179 BCE the first fragments begin to emerge in the historical record. Traditionally, the invention of paper is ascribed to Kai Lun, an imperial official of the Han Dynasty around 105 CE, though it's possible he was actually just the first to really master the process, given the evidence of the presence of paper in China already hundreds of years before. So what set this apart from papyrus? Kai Lun used mulberry, bast fibers, fish nets, old rags and hemp waste, which he mashed and disintegrated into a wet pulp, which could then be pressed and dried into flat sheets. This created a smoother, more even surface and a stronger, more flexible surface, one not as prone to splitting as papyrus with its seams and joins between strips of plant. And the incorporation of rags and waste as the base material made it far more affordable to produce. This process remained largely unchanged all the way into the 18th century, by which time the process had spread into Central Asia, been mastered and refined in the Middle East, and then carried into Europe, with paper mills beginning to appear all over, still using linen and cotton rags as their base materials. This led to paper mills frequently dealing with shortages, even advertising for people's cotton and linen rags as they tried to meet the demand for paper. Once again, the process needed to change. A more easily available base material was needed. This emerged in the 1830s when two different men on two different continents, Germany and Canada, began to experiment with using wood pulp instead of linen and cotton rags. And this changed everything. With such a widely available and affordable base material, by the 19th century, paper had completely transformed the economies and societies of industrialized countries, and we are still feeling that transformation today. For a process that transformed the entire world, it's fitting that the process involved contributions from all over the world. We started with the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, then the papyrus of Egypt, the parchment of Greece, the paper of China, and then the wood pulp innovation born out of both Germany and Canada that exploded the everyday common use of paper throughout the world. Where would literature, science, education, art, history, communication, and society be without paper? So much of our modern world has its roots in our relationship and interactions with paper. So what is the next step in the process of how we write today? Is it the end of paper, replaced entirely by screens? Or will paper with its physical presence and tactile qualities continue to be prized by humanity, as it has been for thousands of years? One thing we can know for certain is that the process that began in 4000 BCE has not stopped yet, and paper and its legacy will continue to shape our communication, our communities, and our world.